Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the sacrifices with the knight, and specifically we're going to focus on a very thematic type of sacrifice, which is the sacrifice on the f7 or the f2 square. The important thing about these squares is that one of the most vulnerable points on the chessboard, some people even refer to it as the Achilles heel of a position. And the reason for this is because if we notice the kings, the white king on e1 and the black king on e8, they are the only piece that defends this pawn, which is very, very close to the monarch. So therefore, it's kind of a ready-made target. Let's imagine, for instance, that the white bishop, it moves to c4, striking at f7, and perhaps the knight on g1, that can move either to e5 or g5 and strike at f7. So we can readily picture a situation where that pawn on f7, it gets captured. So we can readily picture a situation where that pawn on f7 gets attacked by a lot of pieces very quickly, and black's defenses are overrun, or similarly for white on f2. So we will in fact begin with a quick look at the fried liver attack. You guys will see what I mean. In this position, white begins with the move e4, and black responds with e5. White brings out his knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop c4, knight f6, knight g5, and we see that there is an immediate attack on the f7 point with both of the pieces already mentioned. So black blocks the attack with the move d5, and now pawn takes d5, knight takes d5. This is in fact considered a mistake. Most of the time here they play the move knight to a5, and the reason is because they want to avoid the fried liver attack. Here white has the move knight takes f7. And we see that the knight sacrifices itself on that vulnerable f7 point. Black has no choice but to capture, of course. The knight has not only won a pawn, but is now forking the queen and rook. Black captures the knight. Queen goes to f3 with check, and this is the point. The point is that the queen will now strike at the knight on d5 and at the king. Black must either give back the piece if he moves anywhere with his king except for e6. So he has a choice to either give back the piece or venture forward with his king. The follow-up by white is knight to c3, putting more pressure on the knight on d5. White would like to win his piece back since he sacrificed it. All is not lost for black here. Black plays the move knight c to b4, and this is a good move because on the one hand it defends the knight on d5, and on the other it has a threat of its own. Knight takes c2 would fork the king and rook. So white plays queen to e4, defending the point on c2 and also preparing the move d4, since now the black king is standing on the same file as the queen. Black goes c6, white plays a3. Black now steps the knight back now that the pawn on c6 is defending the knight. And here white plays the move d4. Clearly, black has managed to hang on to his extra piece, but his king is in a very dangerous situation, his knight is in a little bit of trouble, and also his pawn on e5 has some problems. So in fact, well, this is what computers are for, and deep analysis, we're not going to go into this, but in general, the theory says that white is doing very well in these kind of lines, so black tries to avoid it. For our purposes, let's step back to the position here. We see the first of several sacrifices on f7 with a knight. This is what we would call a true sacrifice because there's no clear path for white to get back his piece. Let's take a look at some more sacrifices on f7. In this game, white opens up with e4, once again, And now black responds with c6, the Caro-Kann. d4, d5, knight to c3, d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight d7, bishop c4. So far, everything is pretty normal. Here, more common to move out the g8 knight. Knight d to f6, knight to g5. We see once again that pressure on f7. Black brings the knight to d5 to block the access of the bishop. White develops. And here black plays the move h6. Notice that this move leaves the g6 square a little bit less well defended than before. And just this minor detail contributes to the soundness of white's knight sacrifice next move. White captures the pawn on f7. Black must once again accept the knight. And now knight e5 check. Now black has a few squares that he could go to. e6, f6, or e8. e8 would be for sure the worst here. Queen h5 check. No move other than g6, and queen takes pawn is checkmate. If king to f6, white will still play the move queen h5, and we see the threat of checkmate on g6. Black would have to step away, and now a clever move by white. Queen goes back to e2. The idea is that by x-raying the black king, white prepares for devastating discovered checks like knight takes pawn on c6, which would hit the queen on d8, or knight g6 check, which would hit the rook on h8. In fact, there's not much that black can do. If he goes to d6, well, in that case, knight f7 would be really a very nasty triple fork here with the knight. And if instead he goes to f6, then white can continue to play quietly with the move bishop to d3. The logic behind this move is to take control of that f5 square, so that if black, let's say, plays a silly move, white will step the queen onto f3 with check. The king will only be able to go to e6, and now either bishop f5 check or queen f5 check are both winning for white. Let's see, for instance, if bishop f5 check, king f6 or king d6. If king d6, we have once again knight f7 check. And if king f6, we will capture the bishop with a discovered check. And in fact, it will be checkmate next move, because the only move for black is knight to f4, and queen takes f4 is checkmate. So in fact, after bishop to d3 that controls this f5 point, black cannot really do much useful. g6 is best, but after queen f3 check anyway. Bishop f5 is best, but g4 means that white, at the absolute very least, will get back his sacrifice piece. And of course, the black king continues to be extremely weak. Let's see a couple more examples now. Here we have a middle game position where once again, that pawn on f7 is looking a little bit weak because only the king defends it and the white knight is attacking it. So there is potential danger there. Black played the move knight to d7, and now white went queen to e2. We see that now it's especially dangerous because after knight takes f7, king takes, white would follow up with queen takes e6 check. Notice how in the original position we were looking at, this queen on c8 was covering the e6 square. But after the move knight to d7, that was no longer the case. Here, for example, we see the queen on c8 is eyeing up that e6 point. Black played the move rook to e8. Now, this move seems logical because let's say that black played again a silly move. White would go knight takes pawn on f7, typical knight sacrifice. Black would capture, white would capture on e6, black would have to step the king away, and white would take this bishop. So he'd have won a couple of pawns, have an attack, and it would be game over. Therefore, black must have seen this. Black, after all, was a very strong player, and he played the move rook to e8. In this way, black defends the bishop, and so if white captures on f7 now, black expects to play king takes f7, and if queen takes pawn, then the king will simply drop back, and, well, white has won 2 pawns, but black has won a piece, and that is a good deal. Well, it must have come as a shock to black when white, in this very position, did exactly that. He captured on f7. Black has to accept the sacrifice. Queen takes e6, and sure enough, black drops the king back to f8. But white had seen one move further, and plays the brilliant bishop to h5. Notice how it's very, very typical that after the knight gets sacrificed on f7, the f7 square becomes chronically weak. And it's very, very typical that white will exploit that square with other pieces besides the knight. The problem here is that the checkmate is threatened and there's no good response. If the pawn goes to g6, then bishop h6 would be checkmate. And if knight takes bishop, which is maybe the best resistance, white will capture on e7, rook takes e7, only move, queen takes e7, the king will step to g8, and after even a move like knight to e4, for example, the white position is really, really, really good, to the point where I would say that black pretty much has no chances to get back into the game, in spite of the fact he's not so much material down. His pieces are not coordinated, and his king is very weak. Here we have a position with white to play. Black has just played the move h6, and white here plays a fantastic move, knight to d6, ignoring the attack on his bishop. Black captures the bishop, and it should come as no surprise that white here sacrificed on f7. Knight takes f7 is now attacking the black queen. Black in fact played the move queen to a5 here, insisting on not accepting the knight. However, as the game played on, knight takes g5, rook f8, bishop takes d7, queen takes a2. About 5 or 6 moves later, black in fact resigned. And the reason for this is because material is approximately equal, and in fact it's exactly equal, but black's king is very unsafe. However, what we want to see is why black didn't accept the knight. So let's rewind. Here is the position. Well, if black had captured the knight, white would follow up with knight takes g5 check. And now the king can go to either f6, f8, or g8. But as it turns out, none of them are good enough. If the king goes to f8, then white simply plays knight e6 with check, winning the queen. If the king goes to f6, then in this position, white has the move knight h7 check. The king can go either to e6, back to f7, or to f5. But none of them are good enough. If king e6, for example, bishop b3 check, king f5, queen f3 is now checkmate. And as you can imagine, if king f5 or king f7, the solution is very similar, either bishop b3 check or queen f3 check. In either case, the black king doesn't survive. And one important detail to note is that we see that the whole white attack takes place around the light squares. The light squared bishop combines with the knight, which initially sacrifices on f7. The queen on d1 steps forward onto f3 and gives a nasty check. And this should come as no surprise because black has no pawn on f7, an important light squared pawn. That leaves this whole diagonal completely open, which is exploited by the bishop. It leaves the king open along the f-file, which is exploited by the queen. And it also means that black can never guard the g5 square with a pawn. For example, the f7 pawn could push to f6 and guard the g5 square. And that's not possible, and sure enough, the knight exploits this fact. That is the reason why here black did not accept the sacrifice. Now, for example, if king to g8, white would go queen b3 check, king h8, queen h3 check, king g8, bishop b3 check, and if king f8, then the final piece, we've noticed the queen and the bishop both delivering nasty checks, and now the knight goes to h7 and actually gives checkmate. So we can see that no matter what black plays, the attack is quite straightforward to conduct for white, and there is no defense. So that is why the sacrifice was rejected. We've seen a few sacrifices on f7. Let's take a look at one sacrifice on f2 to show that there's also a concern if we are white. It's not only good things that can happen to us, we can also get attacked along f2. So let's show one example. If this position is in any way familiar to you, it's because it is from a very, very famous game between Robert Eugene Byrne and Robert James Fischer. The latter, of course, especially well known. He was the great Bobby Fischer, one of the best chess players of all time. This was played when Fischer was quite young, and he has just planted this knight on d3. And we notice that, sure enough, that point on f2 is quite vulnerable. If you remember, in the previous example, we noticed that the pawn on f7 and the pawn on e6, there's a connection between the two, which makes sense, right? Because the f7 pawn supports the e6 pawn. So very often, after some piece gets sacrificed, in this case the knight on f7, that point on e6 can also be exploited. Similarly, in white's case, the pawn on f2, well, its partner pawn is the pawn on e3. So you have to be careful with that one as well. And if we notice, the rook is crashing down on e3. Black, of course, was threatening a move like knight e4, which would be very strong, targeting the queen on d2 and also the knight on c3 and unlocking the power of the bishop. But after queen c2, black uncorks the sacrifice. Knight takes f2. This is a very, very nice sacrifice. White accepts. Knight g4 check. Now we see that the queen and the rook are not very well placed, since the g4 knight may land on e3 very soon. White steps the king back to g1. Of course, there is not really any good alternative for white. If, for example, he stepped the king to f3, then one line runs rook takes e3 check, white picks up the knight, bishop c8 check, king f4, and not the only win, but certainly the fastest and prettiest win, bishop h6 checkmate. So, of course, the white king should be careful to venture forward. We know, of course, that if the king steps to f1, then knight takes e3 will win the queen on c2. If king to e1, then knight takes e3 will be a double attack. So white went king to g1, knight takes pawn on e3, and queen to d2. Fischer's opponent here, Robert Byrne, himself said of this game, "As I sat pondering why Fischer would choose such a line, because it was so obviously lost for black, there suddenly comes this dazzling move. What was this dazzling move? Knight takes g2, eliminating the defender of the white king side. King takes g2, and now a beautiful move, d4. White must accept the pawn, and here we see the point, bishop b7 check. Sacrificing that pawn on d5 was mostly just to get access to this very long diagonal where the king lies on g2. White went king to f1, and now black simply played queen to d7. Even though black is actually down a piece, the white king is so exposed, and a large part of that has to do with the absence of that f2 pawn, that Byrne in fact resigned. And Fischer commented after the game that that was a bitter disappointment for him. He was hoping to see the move queen to f2 played, after which he had intended queen h3 check, king to g1, and now a brilliant move, rook e1 check. The point is, white cannot capture because of checkmate on g2, and so he must capture with the rook. But that rook was importantly defending the knight on d4. After bishop takes d4, the queen and the king are in trouble because the white queen cannot capture the bishop since queen g2 would be checkmate. So in fact, it should be mate very, very soon. Since right now, black is not threatening just to capture the queen. In fact, black's direct threat is queen g2 with mate, taking advantage of the fact that the queen is pinned. I know that I showed a little bit more in this game between Byrne and Fischer than perhaps is directly relevant for what we're looking at, the f2 and the f7 sacrifices, but I just couldn't resist. This is really a brilliant game by Robert Fischer. And it does illustrate right up to the very end an important point, which is that when you eliminate that f2 pawn or that f7 pawn, then this whole diagonal, in the case for white, g1 to a7, in the case for black, a2 to g8, these diagonals become very, very weak. And also the e3 or e6 squares, they become very, very weak. And so it's important to know that you can take advantage of this on top of the immediate destruction of the f7 point by way of a sacrifice. Many times it'll be with other pieces like a bishop or rook, but very, very often, perhaps most often, it is with the king's knight that goes from g1 to f3 onto either g5 or e5, and finally sacrifices on f7, and the same thing for black and his king's knight. So I hope you enjoyed this section, and I will see you in the next one.